the core notion of at least traditional socialism is that what you mentioned, that working people have to be in control of production. The Soviet Union was the exact opposite of that. Working people had no control over anything. They were virtual slaves.
It's all well saying that socialism has to be workers' control over the means of production, but there again lies the problem. It's when you put socialism into practice, right? There's a strong difference between what you speak theoretically to what you put into practice. That's the issue. But even if, for argument's sake, you were to argue in favour of workers' control over the means of production, even if you did argue for that, you still cannot avoid the economic calculation problem. It's unavoidable. It's not something you can avoid, because you essentially require a private sector, like I explained, and of course you require the information of market-driven prices. Now, if you're not going to let the market drive the prices through consumer demand, and if you're going to try and control prices, you're doomed. And even then, you require the private sector to rationally finance your economy. If you're not going to have that, how are you going to rationally, finance your economy off the back of the printing press? Because you're just going to hit hyperinflation. So again, it's doomed. This guy, Noam Chomsky, was the same guy who tried to call the Soviet Union state capitalist. Do you know what state capitalism is? It's basically socialism in practice that could not rid itself of the private sector. Why? Because it's the private sector that finances your economy. The public sector does not pay taxation. The public sector cannot finance itself. It doesn't generate enough to finance itself. It simply is funded by the government. And the government has to take from the private sector in order to finance it. It pays what you call a rebate. Paying a rebate is simply not taxation. It's simply a rebate. It's basically paying a percentage back to the government for what government initially gave you in the first place. And the government has to take from the private sector in order to finance the public sector. So you are essentially doomed no matter where you turn to. You can't avoid it. The economic calculation problems everywhere with socialism. It's not just something that applies to that of the central planning. It applies to socialism in general. You wouldn't know the information of profits and losses because you're not going to let the free market, you're not going to let consumer demand determine what prices are.
Also, why judge an ideology on its most extreme examples? That's like judging a love of baseball by the Red Sox fan who carved Red Sox into his forehead with a broken Miller Lite.
Why do we judge it? Not only because history has already proven why it leads in that direction, but because we understand the reason why it does. Socialism requires force. It requires you to abolish the private sector completely. You require a dictator to step in there and forcibly remove people's private individual property. You require it. You've got no choice. And because human beings are self-interested, let's just say in your theoretical fantasy world that you did get rid of the government. Let's just say you get rid of private ownership completely, 100%, and then you get rid of the central government. The question that you then have to ask is that once you've done so, who is going to stop people like me starting up my own private business again? Are you going to have a group of people oversee to ensure that it's never going to return? Because that by definition is governance. That by definition is authority. That's dictating to other individuals to what they can do with their life. That's stripping them of their individual rights. You require dictatorship to, forcibly remove their individual rights and liberty. In other words, what if I wanted to start up my own private business as a photographer? You would have to forcibly remove that from me. And in order to keep it away from me, you're going to need dictatorship. You're going to need a central government there to keep it out of sight, to keep me from starting up my own private business. Human beings are self-interested. You take away a government and people will go on the path of their own. There's nothing you can do about that. So, and this is why these, systems that you saw under totalitarianism, when people seek their own self-interest, they were shot in the back of the head. In other words, they tried to escape for the shores of Florida and they were shot on sight. Same with that of the people who tried to escape over the Berlin Wall. The only way you can prevent such a thing is by building a wall. And that essentially is why you saw what you did. You didn't see the Berlin Wall for nothing. You saw it for a very good reason. So it's unavoidable. You can't escape the totalitarianism. It's something that's inevitably there. And a self-serving government will always be there so long as you're faced with the knowledge problem and the economic calculation problem, unless the government is willing to surrender and accept that socialism just doesn't work. So you're basically doomed from no matter where you turn to, whether you turn to your central planning through this idea of democratic socialism, or whether you turn to this idea of libertarian socialism, which is an oxymoron, or just Marxism in general. You cannot avoid it. You will always face the issue where if you try to completely abolish the private sector, you are going to require dictatorship there to keep that out of sight. And like I said about the money, where are you going to get the finances to finance the economy? Because you're certainly not going to last long trying to finance that off the back of the printing press.